Welcome to the Psychedelic Couch. Before we dive into today's discussion, we remind our listeners that using illicit drugs carries significant risks and legal consequences. Psychedelic substances like LSD, psilocybin mushrooms, MDMA, and DMT are illegal in many countries, including the UK, and their possession or use can lead to legal penalties. Psychedelics can have profound effects on mental and physical health. While some report positive experiences, others may face negative effects like anxiety and psychosis. These substances can also interact unpredictably with medications and underlying conditions. Approach psychedelics with caution and responsibility. This podcast shares information, not encouragement or advocacy for illegal use. If you or someone you know struggles with substance abuse, seek help from healthcare professionals or local support services. In this episode, I talked to Tobias Penno, who is an academic and lecturer in social work at the University of Western Australia. We delve into the evolving landscape of psychedelic therapy in Australia, which in 2023 legalised the use of psychedelics to treat some mental health conditions. We discuss his fascinating research into the mental health benefits of ayahuasca and the therapeutic skill set needed for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. I do hope you enjoy the episode. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, very good.
So let's start with, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into this space.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I first got interested in the psychedelic scene, I was halfway through my master's in social work. So I had just transitioned in my career path. And a part of that was because, throughout my earlier adulthood, I had sort of seen and experienced a lot of people around me struggling with mental health. And then in particular, that kind of culminated with a close friend of my brother's who committed suicide. And that really impacted me. Even though I wasn't particularly close with this person, I was close with my brother and that wider community, and I really felt their grief. And that really touched me. And also made me look around and kind of question, like, what is going on, and in particular with our social fabric, like what was going on in his system, in his life system that led to something like this. And it was interesting at the time, when I saw a lot of his friends, I saw such a tremendous outpouring of love. And I wondered how much of that was present before. And I wondered, how much of that is present for a lot of other people who are struggling with mental health. And it sort of struck me that, yes, there is something a little bit awry, something a bit off with the fabric of our culture. And that eventually led me to a place where when I looked at online, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, Googling different things. I found social work, I read it. And I was just like, yes, this is speaking my language, very systems perspective on health and well-being. If the fish is sick, do we look to the fish or do we look to the pond kind of thing? And so, yeah, social work really stood out to me. And so thus begun this new pathway, because up until then I had been studying science and engineering. And so I'd gone from the very hard end of science to the very soft end of science.
Tobias Penno is an academic and lecturer in social work at the University of Western Australia. His first academic publication, titled How Ayahuasca Offers Psychosocial Wellbeing, won the Social Work Research Prize in the School of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Science at the University of Western Australia. Tobias is the current chair of the Australian Psychedelic Society and coordinates the Mental Health Professional Network's local psychedelic community of practice. His primary research focus is on the therapeutic skill set for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Tobias is passionate about the role of social work in this field and is currently part of the therapy team for Reset Mind Sciences, a Perth-based clinical trial using psychedelic medicine for treatment-resistant depression. How are you doing?
Good. Yeah, very good.
So let's start with, maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you got into this space.
Yeah, sure. I mean, when I first got interested in the psychedelic scene, I was halfway through my master's in social work. So I had just transitioned in my career path. And a part of that was because, throughout my earlier adulthood, I had sort of seen and experienced a lot of people around me struggling with mental health. And then in particular, that kind of culminated with a close friend of my brother's who committed suicide. And that really impacted me. Even though I wasn't particularly close with this person, I was close with my brother and that wider community, and I really felt their grief. And that really touched me and also made me look around and kind of question, like, what is going on, and in particular with our social fabric, like what was going on in his system, in his life system, that led to something like this. And it was interesting at the time, when I saw a lot of his friends, I saw such a tremendous outpouring of love. And I wondered how much of that was present before. And I wondered, how much of that is present for a lot of other people who are struggling with mental health. And it sort of struck me that, yes, there is something a little bit awry, something a bit off with the fabric of our culture. And that eventually led me to a place where, when I looked at online, I was trying to figure out what I was going to do with my life, Googling different things. I found social work, I read it, and I was just like, yes, this is speaking my language, very systems perspective on health and well-being. If the fish is sick, do we look to the fish or do we look to the pond, kind of thing? And so, yeah, social work really stood out to me. And so thus begun this new pathway, because up until then I had been studying science and engineering. And so I'd gone from the very hard end of science to the very soft end of science. And it was halfway through my course that I traveled to South America for a year-long kind of gap year trip. And at a certain point on that trip, I came across a charismatic fellow called Jared from the US in Breckenridge. And he looked at me and he just heard the way I was talking. And he just said, dude, you have to try this thing called ayahuasca. And I hadn't really heard of it up until that point. But I did a bit of reading, did a bit of research, asked him some questions. And I thought, yep, I'll give this a go. This sounds really interesting to me. And especially as a social worker, I was kind of coming to it with this a little bit of a scientific hat on, like, oh, I'm going to go and I'm going to test this thing out and see if it could be helpful for people. And then, of course, what happened for me was, on the first night that I drank it, I felt that my life had been permanently changed. That there's a distinct life before that moment and life after that moment. And that sort of began me on that journey. And ever since then, it's just been, honestly, I've probably overdone it. I do this sometimes, but I literally took every corner of my life and went, I'm going to make it about psychedelics. And that's what I've done for the last 4 years, no, more than 4 years. Yeah.
And I'm curious about and I really resonate with that first ayahuasca experience, which it's like life before and life after. How did you integrate that? So you were traveling, you were there was it Peru or somewhere in South America, for a year. How long were you at the retreat center for? How much exploration did you do in that trip? And then how did you integrate that coming back to Australia and to life?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I feel like there's almost like a culture shock, of coming back to your regular life after an experience like that, especially, if it was in this kind of where you're surrounded by a community of other people that are also engaging with these medicines. It can be such a profoundly connective experience and quite beautiful and all of these things. And then you come back to this regular life and it can be a bit of a shock. So, the context is that I had that first experience at the beginning of the trip, and it was like, blew my mind and totally changed the way I was seeing things. And honestly, the integration process while I was traveling was kind of messy and complicated. And so what I decided to do towards the end of my trip was to return back to the place that I had started. And I actually spent a month there in kind of like a self-made retreat in a little place called Pisac, not far from, it's in the Sacred Valley. And that's not far from Cusco. And I sort of spent my time doing yoga, meditation, doing different workshops, doing ayahuasca ceremony, and also doing some Wachuma ceremony as well. And that was where I really had that chance to sink into it, do a deep dive, and try to understand it. And so for me, that was it was an immersive process, and the integration was an iterative component of, going into ceremony, coming out, doing a meditation, and then reflecting, doing meditation, embodiment practices, trying to work out what does this mean for my life, and then going back to the medicine, and then being surrounded by other people all on the same journey, constantly having conversations with them, like, how are you integrating this in your life, and learning from each other. And so that was a really special time to spend that month just completely focused on those experiences. And then coming home was different. Yeah, I guess the way that I've integrated it is that, for me, like, what psychedelics offer us is a new way of looking at healing, a new way of looking at health and the body and the mind, that's more integrated, that's more holistic, that's more communal. And so I think that the psychedelic experience needs to be not just something that's integrated by the individual, but something which is integrated by the collective. So how do we like make sense of, how do we integrate what the psychedelic experience means into our culture? And for me, that's like, okay, we need to change our culture. And that's kind of what I'm committed to, is the cultural shift that psychedelics, I think, can help us make. And who knows, maybe when we get there to that shift, psychedelics won't be as cool and mystical and interesting like they are at the moment. They'll be like, people will kind of shrug their shoulders and go, oh yeah, cool, psilocybin, that's nice to do every now and then. But, we live in a culture now that actually embraces so much of what psychedelics represent, that it's not as necessary. But right now, I do feel that it is necessary to make that transition.
Can you, I'm assuming that when you got back, the paper that you wrote that you won the awards for, how ayahuasca offers psychosocial well-being, can you tell us about the findings? Or
yeah, that was part of my integration, I guess. I'd had this experience, and I thought, okay, this is legit. This stuff's legit. There's something real here. And I very tentatively sent an email to my professors at the time in social work, thinking, oh God, what are they going to think of me? I want to write a thesis on psychedelic drugs. But I suppose I shouldn't be that surprised, but they were very much like, of course you can. Of course, like, if you're willing to put in the work to back yourself, to do the research and make this a legitimate piece of work, absolutely, we support that. So I did. And basically, what I did was an in-depth kind of exploration of the literature around ayahuasca, and trying to kind of come to an understanding around how it helps people. And I came up with 10 themes. The first part is people's kind of attitude towards it, was that they were coming to ayahuasca in the first place because they were a bit fed up with the overly biomedical approach to mental health and healing, feeling that they wanted something that was spiritual, feeling that they wanted something that included, the full spectrum, the bio, psycho, social, spiritual. So they, maybe they had tried the traditional route, the antidepressants, the anti-anxiety, the talk therapy, and they felt that it hadn't quite given them what they wanted. And so they went seeking for something that did that holistic approach. And then within that, what I found was that, there were some core ways in which ayahuasca helped people. One of them was this community support that I've mentioned. People would go to these ceremonies where they would live in this little maloka, this little hut that was just theirs, and they would share the same food with people, they would share the same waters with people, they would go and bathe in the same river with the other people that were also participating in this ceremony, in the retreat. And then they would go and drink medicine with the same people, and they were cared for, they were in constant connection, and sort of like a little glimpse into a different cultural paradigm. And people constantly were reporting how transformational that was alone, just being embedded in that different cultural framework for a period of time. Another one was like psychological distress as being an important part of the transformation. Like, they needed to go into the pain, into the dark, into the scary places, in order to move past it and transform into something else. And, you know, people's individual ceremonies often, if you've drunk ayahuasca, then you get this, there's that kind of build up to this point, that's quite harrowing sometimes. And then, you know, sometimes that's when you purge, or that's when you puke, and maybe there's a release, or, you know, and then at the end, if all goes well, then you kind of land in this place of like peaceful acceptance or transformation. But you had to go through hell first.
Absolutely, and go through the hell of yourself in relation to control. You know, there's often a narrative about the control, right? That we have to get out the way, and it's the battle that we have with our control, which is often the narrative in so many people's lives generally.
100%. Yeah, I mean, that's what it is for me almost every time. There's that, the mind comes in, and it's, you know, it's afraid of letting go. And that's a large part of the benefit of the medicine for me, is that I have to let go, and then I come out the other side a little bit softer, a little bit more open from that experience. One of the themes was ayahuasca as a teacher. You know, I'm sure you've heard this, people talk about all the time, actually experiencing another entity, another being, another intelligence, as actually communicating to them somehow. I mean, some people were quite like atheist or something like that, so they reframed it in their own kind of scientific worldview, and that was kind of, what do they call it? A inner Socratic voice would come to them and have conversations with them, and so they just reframed it in that way. But most people tended to a more like animistic worldview, which is, of course, the worldview of the culture in which it's done, where ayahuasca is viewed as an entity, as an alive, intelligent being. And so they would have these dialogues and feel that they were dialoguing with some, you know, extremely intelligent teacher that could offer them wisdom. So that was a big part of their healing. Other things were like this idea that ayahuasca reveals the truth about yourself. You know, it's a bit like, builds on that theme that we've already been talking about, but it's a bit more specific, like all those things that we deny about ourselves, all those things that we don't want to see about ourselves, can come up and all of a sudden be quite confrontingly put in front of us, but confronting in a way where we accept it. We go, oh, yeah, okay, I see. And one of the things that was interesting was that I'm just remembering, like, what I wrote about this now was that a lot of the time people felt that they had this really horrible thing within themselves, this bad thing within them, something dark, evil, wrong, shameful. And paradoxically, because they were afraid of that truth within themselves, or afraid of this thing that was in themselves, they never looked at it. They avoided it. And in a weird kind of way, it stayed bigger than what it really was, until they had this experience with ayahuasca where they saw it for what it was and realized that it wasn't this giant monster. It was just this little thing, whatever it was. And so paradoxically, by actually facing up to it, fronting up to it, it was just so much less of a feature, you know, of their inner world.
And this idea that maybe darkness lives in everything, in all beings, you know, and having that conversation. I've had an experience, you know, having a conversation with kind of a god of sorts, you know, saying that it has to exist, you know, a kind of begging and bartering that how can you let some of these things happen? There was a narrative of sexual abuse. It was almost everything that's ever happened in all of history you're going to experience now in this moment, because if you're going to hold the mantle as therapists in this space, you need to experience all of it. And I remember, you know, kind of bartering, but how can you let this happen to, you know, babies? And it was just that the understanding that this exists in everything, the darkness has to be there for the light, and it's in the darkness that we open into the light. You know, something that resonated with what you were saying with your brother's friend, you know, it's in that tragic loss that people's love, you know, that's when we can hold each other, we can really be in that openness and that heart space in a way that, you know, we can't if that pain doesn't exist. I don't know if that's making sense at all, but
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We have to open our hearts. It requires courage
Mm,
and a braveness to open your heart to the fullness of life. And to open your heart to the fullness of life means to open it to the pain and
mm.
suffering, as well as the joy and the love. That's really interesting. You had an experience where you were sort of dealt all of this pain, all of this trauma from everyone, from the whole world kind of thing. That's what it was.
It was from the whole world, and again, this battle with control of like, but I
Yeah.
can't, and you know, this isn't something that you can control. You just have to sort of sit here and be in it and sit with all of that, which of course exists in all of us because we are both persecutor and victim, you know, through our lineage. It's almost kind of culminates in this just gigantic experience, which is so hard to almost language now. You know,
Yeah.
that's the thing, right, about these experiences that you then come back into everyday consciousness, and language almost can't quite touch that noetic change, that experience that you have in those states. But
Yeah.
you know that something is fundamentally different and that you can't
Totally.
look at it in the same way again.
No, no, and yeah, that's it. That's it exactly. Well said. Yeah. And have you found having an experience like that, has it, you know, changed you as a therapist and how you deal with the, pain and trauma in clients when that comes up?
I think it's open. I feel opened.
Mm,
I feel opened in a way that I wasn't before. And I feel like I can sit, there's nothing that I can't sit with. There's just an expansion that's happened,
mm,
it feels on a cellular level, and an acceptance of the beauty of everything, and an acceptance that things unfold in the way that they're meant to, that our soul is here to have an experience, and that experience isn't going to be a bed of roses all the time,
yeah.
but it's through that, you know, it's the hero's journey, right? When we go through that, that's when profound learnings come. So I think I've changed in my avoidance of pain. You know, that natural,
Yes.
as human beings, we bring the things we desire and we push away the things we don't want, right? That's ultimately the place that we all sit in. So I notice now that I'm much more kind of curious. So I'll lean into the pain, or I'm less fearful of an outcome. And that has affected me as a therapist, no doubt.
Yeah, I really resonate with that. I often think about how psychedelics could serve as a wonderful tool for training therapists in all of the things that can't be taught in a psychology
Mm,
course. This, what you just described, you can't teach that shit in
yeah.
a course.
Yeah, well, what's interesting is I was talking to someone a while ago who's doing their psychology doctoral training, and I was talking to her about plant medicines and ayahuasca, and her response was, oh, "I'd never do that. I'd never do that. I don't want to go there." And I thought, how curious, you know,
Yeah.
how curious that for me it feels like a necessity that as a therapist to be able to, if I'm going to go to the dark places with people, then I need to be brave enough to have gone there myself.
Yes. Yes. 100%. Yes. Love it. I love what you said as well about that, like that kind of enhanced acceptance as well. Almost like you're more in touch with this ability to sort of, that idea of post-traumatic growth where people come out the other side and find a beauty or a meaning or something, that they cherish, even though their experiences were difficult. And this idea that we as therapists can also have that experience with our clients, that by stepping into those darker and those more difficult places, that there is an opportunity there to expand, our sense of what humans are capable of and what they can experience and what they can
Mm.
hold in their life through joining our clients in what they're holding and what they're experiencing in their lives.
Tell us about the PhD. You know, I'm really interested in the work that you're doing in that space.
So the PhD is the next evolution. So I did my master's dissertation, and then I went and worked in the field for a while. I worked as a counselor. I worked as a child protection worker, and it was towards the end of my work as a child protection worker that as much as I did love that work, it was very challenging. And I did experience burnout, at a certain point in that work. But I remember I got through that burnout and I got to the other side, and I needed to do that for myself before I would let myself leave that workplace. And so once I'd done that, that's when I left and decided it was time to turn my attention back to this passion with psychedelics. And it was very fortuitous timing because I started my PhD in 2020 and decided to start practicing as a psychedelic integration therapist at the same time. So I was doing some integration work, writing my PhD. And it was over the course of those 4 years writing the PhD that all this change has happened. Psychedelics are now legal in Australia. How wild! I wouldn't have predicted that in my wildest dreams. I was thinking we were decades away. And yes, so it's really, really exciting time to have kind of stepped into the field. And the reason that I chose this topic was because in my attempts to integrate those experiences with ayahuasca, I had found embodiment. I had found teachers who taught embodiment, tantric kind of work, yoga, breath work, like that kind of stuff. And I had found that those practices were profoundly helpful for me to maintain a connection with so much of what I had been exposed to with ayahuasca, and allowed a more sustainable way of maintaining that connection to my body, connection to spirit that is, animate through the body and through nature. And so I had found my path through embodiment. Then, that kind of sparked this interest. Okay, what is the role of somatic work, embodiment work in psychedelic integration, which, as I discovered through doing the PhD, it's more than just the integration. I think that a really well done psychedelic, especially if you're working with complex trauma and things like that, well done psychedelic work should mostly actually be quite embodied, quite soft, quite parasympathetic. Whereas like a lot of psychedelic culture can be quite hard hitting in their approach to the way it's done, and people have quite distressing, difficult experiences. And what I've discovered through this work is that it doesn't have to be that way, and that it probably shouldn't be that way very often. But I'm not being anti the big experiences, the 3 cups wild kind of blow your mind out there experiences. But I just think that there's a different way, maybe a more feminine way, a more soft and nuanced way. And that's what I think embodiment can bring to the psychedelic world. And so I started this PhD. At some point I had a chat with Rosalind Watts, who's a researcher over in the UK, about what I was doing, and she kind of guided me to collapse this research into one project, which was essentially to interview therapists who are trained somatically and who did psychedelic work, and ask them, what are you using? What are the tools? What are the skills, practices, knowledge, philosophy that comes from your somatic work that's useful in your psychedelic work? And so that's the driving question.
And what have they reported?
Thus far, what have they reported? It's a big question. So they have reported a lot of things. What I've tried to do in my PhD is kind of summarize the core message from these therapists into 4 areas. One is philosophy, one is knowledge, one is capacity, and one is practices. And so it's kind of focusing on, okay, the philosophy is like, how are they orienting themselves to this work? The knowledge is like, what do they need to know about how psychedelics work? And then the capacities is about what do they need to have within themselves to be able to do this work. And then the practice is kind of speaking to like the step-by-step, what do they actually do with psychedelics informed by somatic work. And so the philosophy, if I were to try and summarize it, I think it's that these practitioners were positioning themselves with the massive priority of relationship. And a philosophy of service and honor and care. And they viewed the client as, having that inner healer, that inner directedness. And the way that I think a lot of them were viewing it was that inner directedness could be accessed through the body. That inner healer could be accessed through the body, or even, resided in the body, perhaps. But at the very least, the body was an access point for that intelligence, that healing intelligence. So when we slow down and really start to listen to the cues from the body, and we as a therapist hold space for somebody to unfold into that and have that really embodied sense of trust in that process, then people will contact that intelligence. And especially if you guide them towards a psychedelic experience as well, then that can really enhance that process. So that was something that many of the therapists reported, was that, psychedelics deepen somatic experience. Not 100% of the time, but a lot of the time, people have an enhanced access to, all of those cues, the intelligence of the body, and are able to feel their body in a new way and notice all of the minute constrictions that might be going, as they start to access certain memories and thoughts and feelings and relationships, in their mind. Their body's also coming along for the ride, and it's doing all sorts of things that suddenly our awareness to be able to tap into what's going on in the body whilst we're processing or thinking about things is just dialed right up on psychedelics.
And as you were talking, I was thinking about clients who really struggle with interoception. The impact then, I don't know what the answer is, but I'm wondering whether then there could be a way to connect to the somatic system in a way that they haven't been able to before.
Totally, I think so. Yeah. And different psychedelics do it in different ways and to different amounts. And that's an aspect of my project that is still not that well developed. And in fact, I don't think I will develop that. I think that's for somebody else to look at, like exactly how does each psychedelic enhance somatic experience. I mean, ketamine, for example, we know is like a dissociative anesthetic. So in theory, it should make you quite dissociated and disembodied. But paradoxically, a lot of therapists report that at the low dose, it's almost like, I don't think this is quite what's happening, but it's almost like because the ketamine is doing the dissociation, the person doesn't need to as much anymore. Mm-hmm. Like that's taken care of. So now I can be curious towards my body in a new way. And then, mushrooms is more touch and go. Sometimes it can send you astral, like to, I don't know, spiritual land. And sometimes it does take people right into their bodies. Ayahuasca, 100%, ayahuasca you can't separate what ayahuasca is doing from the body and the gut and that whole, it's a profoundly embodied experience. MDMA, is just so profound for giving people that sense of compassion for themselves. And that just opens up so much curiosity that can be held towards the body and exploration of trauma and how trauma is held in the body. I mean, that one in particular seems to have a real profound capacity for that sort of stuff. So, so there's different kind of, I mean, even weed, I think there's some people who call weed the somatic psychedelic because it's so connective to the body. So, we're still discovering exactly how each different one does that, but one way or the other, they all have that capacity to enhance interoceptive awareness.
And then in terms of the kind of the tools or the ways that the therapists use that, can you tell us a bit more about that? And is that in the session itself or afterwards, how they will use embodied practices?
It runs all the way through to different degrees, but it's the whole process is built around a different approach to psychedelics, where this is fundamentally a psychotherapeutic process and a somatic psychotherapeutic process, and the psychedelics are just kind of an adjunct to that. And so in the prep sessions, therapists might do quite a lot of work resourcing their clients, helping them to build their somatic awareness, to slow down, to drop into their body, to do that exploration, that curious exploration, and kind of take that development of their interoceptive capacity as far as we can without the introduction of a psychedelic, and really spend a lot of time building safety and relationship and trust, embodied connection between the therapist and the client, that sort of like right brain kind of psychotherapy that Alan Shaw talks about. And then even introducing touch to some extent, depending on, the client's needs and things like that. Across the field, most people seem to accept that hands-on touch on behalf of the therapist during a psychedelic dosing can be very helpful when the client is requesting that kind of nurture. And what the therapist that I spoke with said was that that really needed to be something that was embedded into the relational dynamics before you ever went to a dosing session. And this idea that, because I know in some clinical trials, it's sort of like it's like a discussion that's had where they consent touch beforehand and sort of say, oh, is it okay if we do that during the session? And then, maybe they will. And I think that's okay a lot of the time, but I think it's not sufficient. From having spoken to these therapists, just the sensitivity of how touch can be felt in the wrong way by the client, how easily that you can step into that. And especially if they're under a psychedelic, they're not able to, understand what's going on quite as well. They're in an altered state. All of the therapists I spoke with said that needed to be embedded into the relationship so that there was a touch practice in the therapeutic dynamic that was oriented around that person meeting their needs through touch and having their own self-touch practice first, and then inviting the practitioner in to support, adjunct, or enhance that touch that they had with themselves. But yeah, it was like this journey of learning first what actually touch feels good and what touch doesn't feel good for them. Being able to find that, identify it, know it, and then communicate it clearly with the therapist, and have a sort of like a system of both verbal and non-verbal communication around that touch before it then gets brought into the dosing session, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. As you were speaking, I was thinking about, my work as a sex therapist. And so much of that is what you do with clients in terms of sex. You learn first, what touch do you like? It's very hard to articulate to someone else. And that can be a real challenge because it's not something, because we're so in our heads, people aren't necessarily aware of the kind of touch that they enjoy. There's just this expectation that you as my partner should just know. So we're having to learn this language, right? Because we're so disconnected from our bodies.
Yeah.
Which is it's so interesting, right? Because you look at kids and they are so embodied.
Yeah.
But at some point we become so cerebral, it's that's just trained out of you, right?
Yeah, it is. And I think that's part of our cultural framework that we've been, born into, this kind of like, I can't remember the name of this author. They contrast dominator culture from partnership culture as these two cultural paradigms that humans have existed. Or Darsha Narvaez is an author who writes about a culture of competitive detachment, which is kind of the USA, versus a culture of collaborative companionship, which is how we've oriented for most of our 200,000 years of evolution. We've lived in these small band hunter-gatherers of like intense connection and emotional synchrony, and we're so out of touch with that. And we're living in the sort of like the aftermath of so much colonization and war, and we're disconnected from our bodies from that. I think, well, that's what I think, that's part of our cultural heritage, is that we've become cerebral as a way of surviving in this like dog eat dog world. And only now that we are kind of reaching this like global ecological collapse in the modern world are we starting to go, oh, okay, we can't just keep eating up everything and consuming and growing. And, we're starting to have to change the way we approach things. And I think psychedelics could be a tool to help us come out of our heads a little bit and come back into our bodies.
To re-experience what it is to be in connection with ourselves and connection with each other.
And so we're missing that. Our culture doesn't teach us how to have that awareness around touch and safe touch, both non-sexually as well as sexually. And then, you see the consequences of that, I'm sure, in the therapy room, working with people who are, who've been raised in that culture that doesn't have that awareness. So it's an interesting forefront for psychedelic medicines, like the sex therapy space. I'm really interested to know where that might go. I mean, right now everybody's so like, oh, psychedelics, it's this kind of new thing, and it's a bit scary, and there's got to be a lot of rigmarole around how we're going to do it. probably a little bit OTT, I think, like 2 therapists, this intense 9-month process that costs 24 grand, it's probably a bit much. Like, it doesn't have to be that intense. I'm sure we can find better ways to do it. And I'm sure that it has these other amazing opportunities for couples therapy. I mean, MDMA for couples therapy, MDMA for, dealing with the trauma in our bodies associated with, sexual past and or intergenerational trauma that we've kind of inherited. I mean, there's so much work that could be done. Is that something that you're interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very interested in that, and how psychedelics can help with sexual dysfunction, or what we class as sexual dysfunction. There's so much scope there, and I'm also mindful about the ethical kind of consequences, that we need to be really sure that a couple wants to be together before we bond them. Doing the extensive couples work first before then making that step would be really important, or for me it feels like a very necessary part of the process for them to really think about, do they want to be together long term? I wouldn't want to work with people that are kind of on their way out, but I'm not sure. We're not there yet.
Yeah, not yet. Yeah, I can see that. So important to make sure that relationship is there. And it brings up a thought just about the whole psychedelic field, and the need for that kind of relational safety, I think, in the way that we approach this. Because in so many of the traditions that it was done in-house, in the tribe with your local shaman, or, there was a lot of cultural connectivity and safety embedded into these practices, whereas we in the West are kind of extracting these like sacred indigenous practices and just kind of using them in these kind of new ways, new environments, and in new relationships that don't necessarily have that container to support what might come up in a psychedelic experience. And I think that applies to the couple as well. Like, is this couple actually ready to hold, the shadow, the darkness, the stuff that might come up from a psychedelic experience? And you'd want that anchor to be pretty strong before you embarked on that journey.
Yeah, and to know that they're both ready, rather than one. And often you experience that in therapy, that you've got the dragger and the draggee, and you'd really want to make sure that the draggee was ready, and not feeling somehow coerced into that. So if it feels to me that there would be some very important, necessary preparation to do before you just jump into that.
Yes.
And to have the experience with a therapist who they've done that preparation work with.
Yeah.
So again, seeing it as an adjunct to couples therapy, sex therapy. So tell us more about, obviously with the changes that happened in Australia last year, tell us more about what things are looking like over in Australia.
I don't know what things are like in the UK, but over here, we, despite, I think, being actually a lot more conservative culturally around drugs than the UK, I get the impression that the UK has been across mushrooms in particular for quite a while now, and it's kind of like everybody knows about it and it's kind of okay, not a big deal as much as it is here. Feels a little bit more a little bit more conservative, a little bit like we're afraid more of what mushrooms could be, and there's less familiarity with it. But despite that, on a governmental level, we've made the move to legalize psilocybin and MDMA. And when I say legalize, what's actually happened is it's not decriminalized. It's not legal for anyone. It's that the scheduling of the drug has shifted. So we schedule our drugs into 8 different categories. Oh, sorry, not 8, more than 8, 9, 10 potentially, different categories depending on its role or its utility. And Schedule 9 is prohibited substance. So that's all of the kind of naughty drugs that don't have any medical use. And psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, they all sat in Schedule 9 alongside methamphetamine and other kind of harder drugs. And then one below that is Schedule 8, which is controlled medications. So that's where things like dexamphetamine exists for, ADHD, or ketamine is a psychedelic that was already sitting in Schedule 8 because it's used in other medical procedures. And so they shifted psilocybin and MDMA from Schedule 9 to Schedule 8 exclusively in the context of this therapeutic approach. So MDMA for the treatment of PTSD, in that context, it's a Schedule 8. And psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, it's a Schedule 8. But if you take mushrooms with your mates or MDMA with your mates at home at a party, the kind of trouble that you're looking at getting in is for a Schedule 9 drug, not a Schedule 8 drug. And so they've literally made it more accessible only on a medical level, but not at all on a decriminalization level, which is a bit of a bummer, a bit of a shame. But I guess that just shows where we're at right now. And I think it's a necessary stepping stone. If we can legalize this for a medical approach, and we can sort of pump out a bit of research, start actually trialing it in a community clinic and see how it fares, then we might culturally get to a point where we're a bit more okay with it. And then decriminalization might be a more ready conversation. But I think people are still a little bit afraid for now for that.
Yeah, can you speak of any collaborations or partnerships between academia, government agencies, stakeholders? What is the current climate looking like?
There's a whole suite of different things that are happening, and I'm not across all of it. We've got I think it's our first psychedelic clinic in Australia, the Clarion Centre, which is based in Melbourne. And so they have already, I believe, started treating people. And I think they were the first. So we made it legal in July 2023. And since then, it's been a bit of a scramble, as different organizations and different things have come alive to try and reconcile. Okay, so the TGA's made it Schedule 8. What do we need to do to now make it actually accessible for people? And so one of the things that happened is the emergence of a body called AMAP, and that's the Australian Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Practitioners, I think. Yes, it's a body that's representing the practitioners. And so its role in the psychedelic ecology of Australia is to develop standards. So to kind of be a body that practitioners can register with as psychedelic therapists. So they'll review applications by therapists, and if they've done sufficient training, that they've ticked all the boxes, then they'll register them as a psychedelic therapist. Now, I don't exactly know what that's going to mean for the rest of the organizations, because it's still being formed. So I don't think AMAP has necessarily got the recognition by all of the other organizations to actually have the power to kind of say, yes, you're a registered psychedelic therapist. But that's how they're positioning themselves. And then you've got RANZIP, the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. And I haven't really, I don't want to speak for these organizations, but I get the feeling that they're kind of a lot more oriented towards a medical understanding and a medical approach to psychedelic medicines. And so you've got RANZIP, you've got AMAP, and then you've got the Therapeutic Goods Administration who legislate the laws around drugs. And then you've got all of the different national bodies of the therapists, the psychologist national body, social workers national body. And it sort of seems like there is not yet a coherent narrative that has emerged out of this ecological system. And I'm still waiting for it. And I'm not sure where we're going to land. And I really hope that eventually where we land is a lovely cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary approach that takes into consideration spirituality and the importance of music and, creating these beautiful safe spaces for people and acknowledges the importance of connection to nature in all of this sort of stuff. But right now, the direction that we seem to be going is a bit more in that medical approach. We're going to do psilocybin-assisted psychotherapy for treatment-resistant depression. There's going to be 4 prep sessions, 2 dosing sessions, and 4 integrations. It's going to be this sort of, a bit linear process. But again, I see that as a necessary stepping stone to the more freestyle that I think would be better in the long run.
And do you think there are any parallels or lessons that Australia can learn from other countries have already implemented similar legal changes?
Yeah, this is something that I'm not too on top of, because I don't know what others are doing a lot. I know that there's a lot happening all over the world. There was the Synthesis Institute, and they had some issues that they ran into. And then there's another institute in the Netherlands called Inward Bound. Have you heard of Inward Bound?
No.
So they do psilocybin retreats, and I think that their center is a beautiful model. I really love what they're doing, and it's holistic, and it's this there's this big, beautiful red brick kind of house with tall ceilings out, in the countryside, and they've got a team of different practitioners with different specialties. They've got scientists who are, nerds on mycology and bring the science, and then they've got musicians who are highly trained musicians who bring that musical quality. They've got they make sure that they feed and take care of people with really nutritious, healthy, high quality food the whole time they stay there. They embrace the spiritual side of things. They do it in groups with an altar in the center, and so it's kind of like this mixed approach of professional but also spiritual, grounded, embodied. And I just think that they're doing a really amazing job, and I like that model that incorporates all of these different skill sets and does it in groups. And it's not clinical per se. It's like we're not doing psilocybin for depression, where we're bringing people together in a way that allows them to touch their common humanity, and whatever they're bringing, whatever walk of life they're on, whatever age they're on, all is welcome, and we're going to do this together. And I think that's really gorgeous. And I just don't think that psychedelics really belong in this, one pill for one mental health disorder because of one genetic, issue. It just doesn't make sense to me. And I think that psychedelics are challenging, some of the fundamental premises of psychiatry, and we're trying to reconcile that as we go. So that's just one place that I think is doing a really beautiful job. I think there's also some truffle centers in Jamaica that do, similar kinds of models that are quite holistic and incorporate all of these different dimensions. But yeah, it's tricky. I think that something I noticed here in Australia was that when it started to become legal and there was more energy around it, all of a sudden it felt like there were these big companies getting involved, kind of like big pharma. There was big pharmaceutical companies that were getting behind it and putting money into research, putting money into potentially developing clinics and all that sort of stuff. And there's been at least a couple of instances where funding just dropped out. And I think it's kind of like the money that you can make from psychedelics is not the same as what you can do from regular psychiatric drugs, because you're just looking at giving people a couple of significant experiences with a few grams of mushrooms, and most of it is actually the psychotherapy that sits around that. So a company who just makes those drugs isn't really looking to make big coin from getting involved in psychedelics. And I can't help but wonder if that's part of what's happened. They got excited, it's a novel drug in psychiatry, and now we're kind of realizing that, it's not as easy to make money out of this as maybe people thought that it would be, or they were perhaps hoping that it would get legalized quicker and we could kind of get to a point like with marijuana where you can sell people microdoses and things like that. But it just doesn't seem to be going in that direction right now. So,
well, and as you were saying that, I was thinking about kind of Indigenous people, and that move away from the very clinical setting. How might these legal changes affect Indigenous communities in Australia? You're considering the use of psychedelics in cultures and the trauma within Indigenous communities.
It's a really good question. And I don't know the answer, because I don't really know even what the relationship between our First Nation peoples are and psychedelic medicines. From what I can speculate and from what I've heard, listening to some botanical experts talk about the constituents that are in the trees here, is that they're probably, it seems very likely that there were practices amongst First Nations Australians, at least some of the groups around the country that used psychedelic medicines as part of their, cultural practices. That seems likely, but I've not heard any like definitive comments around that. And yeah, the different cultures of First Nations peoples around Australia are quite diverse. And so for one community, it might be felt quite differently to a different community, depending on their relationship with these plants. Something that I think about, I'm still learning how to put words to this. So forgive me if this is a little wandering, but in this work that I've done with my PhD, one of the things that does come up quite a lot is this idea that, yes, we, those of us like white or Western, Euro background peoples are part of this Western society, descendants of people who colonized other cultures, probably, descendants of a history of war, and descendants of a people who have colonized other indigenous folks. And in doing so, I think have dislocated ourselves from our own indigenous nature. Like we're all indigenous at a certain level, at a certain fundamental level. We're all from this earth. We're all of this earth. And we all belong to this earth. And those of us in the West have been disconnected from that. And I think so have a lot of Indigenous Australians. And even though it's part of their cultural framework, they know how important it is to have a connection to land, a connection to place. They've been dislocated from that because of colonization, because of the history that we have here. And I sort of see that as a potential place of reconciliation. This is just from my perspective as a white person, that we all need to recapture, reclaim a connection to land, a connection to place, a relationship with the country that we're on, and with the land and the animals and the species and the plants and nature itself. And so that's a common ground that I think that exists between, Indigenous folks and non-Indigenous folks here in Australia. Sometimes I even think that there's almost like three cultures that exist here in this place. The culture of the land itself, the culture of the Indigenous folks, which is quite a similar culture to the land because of that long-standing relationship. And then there's all the other kind of cultures that exist, the white, Western, or potentially other diverse cultures, but which are not Indigenous to Australia. So there's these three kind of cultures. And I think that, I guess this kind of builds on what I was saying, that we all need to develop or build on the culture of the land and develop a relationship to the culture of this land. So I sort of see that as a potential place of reconciliation. And I see psychedelics as a tool for that, because it strikes me that psychedelics amplify people's sense of embeddedness and connection to place. So both, like we said before, like when people have psychedelics, they often experience an amplified sense of connection to their body and interoceptive awareness. And I think it also extends beyond that. Your body is kind of like the first point of contact with nature, and then beyond the body, it's kind of like connection to nature, connection to the natural world, and connection to the body are just two sides of the same coin. And psychedelics enhance our capacity for both of those. So in a very long-winded way, this is just my perspective, my 2 cents. I think that there could be some really beautiful reconciliation work that could be done in these kind of ceremonial communal spaces, group work with psychedelic medicines, processing the trauma of the past, working through how we can work together between these different cultures to build a different future for Australia. But I can't speak for whether First Nations and Indigenous peoples would be interested in that kind of work or not. But that's just what I think about sometimes.
That's beautiful. So I'm wondering, in terms of this new topography that you have, there's something important about education, right? And public awareness to ensure that there is a safe and responsible use of psychedelics, not just under the clinical framework, but more widely.
Yes. Yes, we need to educate. We need to make sure that people know what they're getting into if they're interested in psychedelics. We have a national body here called the Australian Psychedelic Society that has chapters all across the country. And I have been running the Perth chapter, although I've handed that over to some folks that are taking that on now, and they run a whole series of events for the public, from casual catch-ups at the park to integration circles, to kind of like an event that they call Deeper Realms, which is like a experiential sound-based music kind of meditation that's supposed to kind of mirror an altered state without using any drugs, and then through to just straight up lectures and workshops, discussions around particular medicines and things like that. So they're doing quite a lot of work trying to provide that public education, that harm reduction information, getting that out there into the public knowledge. There was an incident just recently, I don't know if you saw it in the news, I think it was in Australia, there someone passed away from an experience with mushrooms, and I'm not sure exactly what the cause was, but some people are saying it was this thing called wood lovers paralysis, which is a thing that can happen in the mushrooms that grow here, the subgarinosa, psilocybin and subgarinosa, which eats wood that's in its diet. And for those ones, sometimes they produce, I assume, some kind of toxin that can cause paralysis. And that could be terrifying, when that happens. It's very rare, but it's really important that people know that can happen. And that's an example of the kinds of things that we need to make sure that the public is aware of, alongside all of the the usual risks and the usual sort of like warnings around what psychedelics can bring up. So yeah, I think there's some really good work that the Australian Psychedelic Society are doing across the country, and they're obviously advocating for a decriminalization of psychedelics, and I really support that mission. And I think that's the way to go, because it sort of seems like the cat's out of the bag now. People know about this and they're interested. They want to get involved. And at the sort of very slow pace that the clinical approach is taking things, I think people are going to get to a point where they're like, fuck this. I want to take my health into my own hands. I want to do this for myself. And they'll either travel internationally if they can afford it, or go underground if they can't, and find somebody who will provide that for them. And because the underground is so unregulated, and because we're not decriminalizing it, there's all these other risks associated with that, legal risks. Also, people are operating in silos in the underground, so there's not that accountability and regulation and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, I just think that it's just a sensible path for us to decriminalize, and then we can really make sure that we educate people, inform them, and make sure that the way that it's happening in non-clinical settings is safer.
So would you say that that's the most pressing priority for policymakers?
I think so. Yeah. Like I said, we've let the cat out of the bag. Like, people know now, people are fascinated by this. They want help, and people are struggling and desperate. And if we dick around too much, if we don't sort of make this accessible to people who need it, which right now it's not, 24 grand for 9-month rounds of psychotherapy with psilocybin as an adjunct. Who can afford that? So if we don't find a better way to make it accessible, and whether it is through a medical paradigm or whether it's through decriminalization and a different model of psychedelic therapy, either way, I think that is something that we need to prioritize, making it accessible to people who need it. Because they will turn to the underground if not, and that's when bad things can happen. I mean, also, even as I say that, just to be a devil's advocate to myself, the underground is also full of some really rich and beautiful, wonderful souls who are doing like amazing work. And actually, for me, 99% of the people I encounter from the underground are doing wonderful things. It is just that 1% that are getting up to no good and causing harm. And even in the underground communities, there are sort of like some levels of accountability, even just through like sharing of knowledge and sharing of of warnings around certain practitioners amongst the community. There is some level of accountability there, but it could be better. But yeah, I just want to say that I think the underground actually has a lot of wonderful people for the most part who actually have the knowledge that the above ground doesn't have.
Mm-hmm.
My hope is that we've kind of like, it's almost like psychedelic underground has been like buzzing away silently for many, many years now, brewing, and it's growing, and the site, like the psilocybin in New York. So there's, emulate what they're doing in New York here.
You've been listening to the Psychedelic Couch. For more episodes, please follow me on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you get your podcasts, and find me on Instagram at the Psychedelic Couch and at Claire Faulkner Therapy, where I will be keeping you up to date on the latest episodes and information surrounding all things therapy, psychedelics, and expanded states.